Nick is Professor of the History of Science and Medicine at the University of Cambridge, and he's co-chair of Cambridge Reproduction. He's the author of books including Embryos in Wax and Haeckel's Embryos, and co-editor of the book Reproduction, Antiquity to the Present Day. He's also author of forthcoming books, the Development Effect, Visual Politics of the Human Embryo series, and also The Many Births of the Test Tube Baby. But sort of bringing it back to the present, he's author of a very recently published article, The Ghostwriter and the Test Tube Baby, a medical breakthrough story. And we particularly invited Nick to speak to this event, one, because I couldn't imagine having it without him with his in-depth knowledge of the history, but also because we thought he'd be fantastic at discussing how Bob's legacy is remembered, particularly through his autobiography with Patrick Steptoe, and more recently through the Netflix film Joy.
Yeah, so we remember Robert Edwards through the memories of those who knew him, such as the wonderful recollections that we've heard this evening, and especially through histories. And some of those histories have tended rather to eat the others. Thanks to Joy, last year's Netflix film that I guess many of you have seen, for many people who didn't know him, Edwards will always be James Norton. And there are worse fates, you might think. Now, Joy was built on recent historical research, and that has amplified the crucial roles played by Jean Purdy and the volunteers in Oldham. There is quite a bit of poetic license, though, that, for example, inserted Purdy into scenes where she wasn't present, such as Edward's first meeting with Patrick Steptoe, or that didn't happen, an interview at the MRC. Now, I could go on, but pedantic historians need to remember the director Ridley Scott's riposte to fact checkers of his film Napoleon, Get a Life. Now, accuracy does matter, but it's more important that a work of mass market history ring true. Now, Joy does several things very well, but actually, I do think it's a problem that it puts Purdy in every scene because it magics away what were and are real obstacles to participation in science, obstacles that we need to recognize if we're to remove them. But Joy also raises the more general question, how have commercial imperatives shaped historical understanding of science, in particular of Robert Edwards? The most important history is one that Alfonso just mentioned, and it's the one that the screenwriters of Joy took as their base, A Matter of Life, published in 1980. This joint autobiography of Edwards and Steptoe traces their separate careers that turned into quests for each other. It pivots around their meeting in 1968 and the ensuing marriage between scientific and clinical approaches then leads to the birth of a healthy baby. Now, the book has been critiqued by feminist scholars, especially Susan Squire, and it's been revised more recently by research, especially Martin Johnson's articles, some of them with Kay Elder and Roger Gosden's biography. Insiders have long regarded it as so full of errors they doubted that Edwards ever read it properly. But it's still in some ways the default account of the science and medicine behind IVF. I recently had a chance to explore how the book was written. The dedication thanks the physician and poet Danny Absey for his invaluable help, but it's never really been clear what he did. Documents in the Edwards papers at Churchill College, Cambridge, revealed that he was hired to do a complete rewrite after the publisher Hutchinson found that the author's first drafts were rather underwhelming. Hutchinson had brought up the inside story of what had been a major global news event, the birth of Louise Brown, and had a lot riding on the book. The editor, Harold Harris, persuaded Edwards and Steptoe to let him bring in a writer. Edwards put up a bit of resistance, although he wasn't entirely happy himself with his first draft. But Harris explained the material is obviously fascinating. The presentation is not. So Absey's job was to adapt the manuscript to the market by fixing the structure, the arrangement and pacing of the events and climaxes, the introduction of other characters, the explanation of technical terms, making sure that the two narrators dovetail into each other and that the authors come across in the way that they would wish. Now, this arrangement was agreed at a meeting in London in March 1979, and Amsey was really taken with Edwards. He writes, I had never met a pure scientist before. Edward strikes him as a born scientist, one without side, without a mask, teeming with ideas, one prepared to take risks that would make most doctors blink. Like Harris, Absey found Edward's fascination with embryos and the descriptions of early development the strongest feature of his drafts, so that many of the passages, like Alfonso just referred to, were already there, but there was still a great deal to change. And we're lucky that Absey's papers in the National Library of Wales make it possible to reconstruct how he went about this. Now, Absey used several strategies, particularly for the two-thirds of the manuscript that Edwards had drafted, including breaking up the relentless prose into engaging chapters, using interviews to elicit extra information so that he could condense the exposition into vivid scenes with characters and dialogue, and adding references that would embed the text in literary culture. Now, Absey knew what he was doing. He had written two autobiographies of his own by this point, and he had the idea that an autobiography, in a sense, buries the real life by altering, obliterating, and accentuating for insight and pleasure. But it's trickier to bury others' lives and still have the result ring true. And that did lead to some tensions in an otherwise amicable partnership. Now, it could work well. Absey was justly proud of a passage in which he had Edwards experiment, like a scientist, with Christianity as a student in Edinburgh by visiting every church, every church of every denomination, a kind of church crawl, as he called it. But Absey, a lapsed Jew who attended a Catholic school, also introduced biblical references. Edwards, an atheist, objected, Danny, this isn't me, but was overruled. There was a price to getting the message out to a wider audience and coming across better and earning, incidentally, also higher royalties. Now, Absey's work, which was in part through interviews, so in collaboration with Edwards and Steptoe, changed the story in two main ways. Edwards, as we now recognize, came rather late in his career to infertility. He'd made his name with immunology that was more directed towards contraception. He was primarily interested for a long time in genetics. He was fascinated by embryos. But Absey adjusted the text so that alleviating infertility became a career-long quest. And so that even the early lab breakthroughs served that end. The public profile of infertility was then low, so it was important to highlight the distress that this caused, and Absey presented Edwards' embryology as aiming to relieve this from the start. Just give one example. Edwards had mentioned less fortunate friends of himself and Ruth Edwards. Following an interview, Absey thickened this. One couple whom we liked very much wanted but couldn't have children. When they visited us and cuddled our babies, I couldn't but be aware of the feelings aroused in them. The trees bore fruit, the clouds carried rain, and our friends, forever childless, played with our Caroline, our Jennifer. So this is a very, many people would recognize, un-Edwards-like passage. But it's crucial in the book in inspiring the idea of embryo transfer to a woman's womb. Secondly, ABSI gave women, wives, assistants, patients, larger roles. Now, this was less feminism than a consequence of fleshing out characters so that readers could relate. So he ensured, perhaps most importantly, that the test tube mother, Leslie Brown, was introduced as a person rather than, as in the initial draft, through laboratory procedures on her embryo. Readers could then feel emotion when Steptoe handed her the baby she'd been told she would never have. Now, Absey didn't give Purdy much more to do, but he did make Jean Purdy a character and gave Edwards the opportunity to acknowledge her more. In the draft, Edwards wrote that she provided ungrudging help, which one might think was itself just a slightly grudging acknowledgement. In the rewrite, Jean's cooperation had become crucial. It was no longer just Patrick and me, we had become a threesome. Now, I want to be clear, there's every reason to assume that Edwards was a keen collaborator on this more generous tribute, but Absey really facilitated the reassessment of Purdy that ultimately led to Joy. The reception of the book was wide and generally positive. So for the Birmingham Post, the story transposes into solid flesh and blood the somewhat shadowy and sometimes almost sinister figures that have lurked behind the headlines, so that we meet them at last as they really are, compassionate and vulnerable human beings, utterly dedicated to helping infertile women. So Absey, who's invisible in the reception of the book, could feel that he'd done a good job, I think. There was some criticism, including of atrocious writing. The British Medical Journal complained, because the book is so commercial, that Steptoe and Edwards have fallen into the hands of the media they criticize so heavily in the book. The commercial imperative is more obvious in Joy, the film, but it's true that through the ghostwriter, the market has molded the histories of IVF right from the start. Now, after Edwards won the Nobel Prize in 2010, Ruth Edwards led the production of a second edition that took out many of the passages that she and her husband had objected to 30 years before. But for better or worse, and it is both, Danny Absey still haunts the history of IVF and of Robert Edwards.